Hello out there, thinkers, linkers, and mappers. We are very happy to host a series of conversations around the topic of tools for thinking. Our longer-term goal is to spark a diverse, connected, shared memory that will help us make important decisions together. Our near-term goal with these podcasts is to interest startups in being part of BetaWorks' upcoming Accelerator Think Camp. BetaWorks is a New York City-based incubator and accelerator. They've run 7 camps before on topics from bots to synthetic media and voice interfaces, always sort of leading edge stuff. You can find out more about Think Camp in this domain by going to betaworks.com/camp, all lowercase. I'm Jerry Mikulski, your interlocutor and obsessive mind mapper. Our topic today is space, pixels, and cognition. My guests are Yiliu, Shen-Burke, and John Underkoffler. If you've watched Minority Report, you've seen John's work. He invented the interface that Tom Cruise uses to find pre-crime, and didn't just do sort of fancy UI design, actually invented a usable and useful gesture language that works called GSpace. And then Yiliu has a software startup called Softpace, and is working in AR, VR, XR sort of domains to try to figure out how data and experiences fit in that space. So, John, how did your life change at the Minority Report marker? Because I'm assuming that the popularity of the movie and the simple attractiveness of the interface that you helped create must have done something pretty huge for you.
Without question. And, it's easy to feel petulant and say, oh, I'm sick of Minority Report, but it's been a perpetual gift. And so, in fact, I'm really grateful. The truth, too, is that when you work on a film, and I've worked on quite a few now, even though I'm not really a filmmaker principally, and I guess I'm a designer and a technologist, but is that you don't know day to day as you're working on it during pre-production, production, post-production, whether it's going to turn out, whether it's going to be any good. I mean, you can be on set and just watch unbelievably brilliant actors doing incredible things, or watch the monitors and see a world-class cinematographer capturing amazing images, and the thing that comes out is still sort of a dull wad of damp dryer lint, and conversely. So I was really excited when Minority Report, was a sort of sharp and even political and beautiful and elusive as it was. And right away, I knew that all the time that I'd spent designing that UI and training the actors, because it was not just Tom Cruise, it was also Neil McDonough and Colin Farrell, and there's interesting stories there, had really paid off. And people still talk about Minority Report, which is amazing to me. And so there's something about the process that we undertook that was really dedicated to an actual verisimilitude, not a sort of, cinema level thing, which is entirely the consequence of the production designer, the great Alex McDowell's world building approach there. So Minority Report led directly to a whole bunch of things, including my eventually long-toothed startup, Oblong Industries. And frankly, it was in describing what we were trying to do with Oblong, it literally saved dozens or hundreds of hours out of my life and my colleagues' lives, because trying to describe an alternate UI, and here we're getting right into the meat of the thing, is ridiculously difficult. People are so kind of blinded into the increasingly uncapable UIs that we're all saddled with today, that saying, no, this is the thing where you use your hands and there's screens all around you. It's not just one little rectangle. It sort of gives rise to cartoon question marks floating above people's heads. But instead, we were just able to say, have you seen Minority Report? And most people had, and bang, that was it. The weird thing is that even though we and the writer and the director and everyone involved in the film knew that we were making this deliberately kind of gray, ambiguous, obviously noir inflected, and sort of political, query, like, is it okay to give up all of your privacy in exchange for convenience, in exchange for commerce and the rest of it? The tech world didn't take it that way. The tech world has used Minority Report as a shopping list, basically, of startup ideas. And there are literally hundreds of startups like, oh, what if we did predictive policing and just arrested people based on an algorithm, right? That's all over the place. What if we installed cameras everywhere? What if we made robots that go try to find perpetrator, like, so, and we're like, no, that was supposed to, the point was that was a bad idea. But anyway, there you are, the power of cinema.
That's super interesting. I hadn't quite thought about it that way, but it's sort of like occasionally there are object lessons that totally miss their mark. Somebody says something or does something that is misinterpreted entirely, or where the message is just missed, right?
Indeed.
And as we look at Mark Zuckerberg's renaming of Facebook to Meta and his pitch for the metaverse, and I've critiqued this a little bit online, it's like what he showed would have been embarrassing for Second Life to show a decade ago. Or 15 years ago. It's like, intriguing. Like, have we made no forward progress on this?
And I guess he's forgotten as well that the metaverse is actually the medium, the vector by which everyone is infected with this horrible kind of cognitive virus in the book, right?
Oh, never mind the negative thing or snow crash, right?
Yeah,
exactly. Yiliu, can you just tell us a little bit, narrate for us, how did you get to Softpace? What was your path to the startup?
Sure. Thanks for that intro, Jerry. And thanks for that very insightful behind the scenes snapshot, John, of what it was like to work on Minority Report, which I did also rewatch recently and thought there's a lot more in here than just the floating UI. Like, there's a lot in there. So, the self-driving cars, the genetically modified plants that can poison you, amazing stuff. The backstory to Softpace is that I was working in this design and art studio here in Berlin as a research resident. This was in 2016 when the Oculus DK2 had just kind of come out, or that was sort of the state of the art in terms of VR hardware. And the studio had bought this headset to try to see the potential of this, exciting new technology, either as a medium for artworks or as a tool for the production of other non-digital artworks. And when they bought it, they realized, oh, there's not, like, you can't download an app and just try it out. There's nothing on this thing. So they somehow found me. I was willing to take a break from architecture school at the time to come for a year and just play with this device. I've been wanting to get my hands on one for a while. I had sort of been teaching myself coding throughout architecture school, and this was a good opportunity to get paid to learn to code. Although they know this, I guess, but they didn't know this at the time. It was a really fantastic year. I had once a week or once every 2 weeks sort of prototyping cycle. I would build something, show it around. People had a good time, and at some point, the idea started occurring to me that a lot of these prototypes we were building, where we were showing 3D models of physical artworks and people were able to look at them, or we were showing just photographs, reference images, reference materials in a virtual space. A lot of these experiments were starting to hint at the possibility of a new way of working that actually grew a lot from the practices and the advantages of the physical studio that we had around us. It's this old beer brewery in the middle of Berlin. And
sweet, sounds like a great space.
It's incredible. It's absolutely incredible workspace. And so much of the success of the studio comes from it having this physical environment where different teams could materialize their thoughts, they could externalize their ideas. Passers-by would be able to sort of stop and say, oh, look, this reminds me of something I'm working on downstairs. Like, why don't you come to the welding, shop, and we can sketch out something or try this idea. And this idea just sort of started infecting my mind like a mind virus. And I would wake up in the middle of the night thinking, oh, I really, like, why doesn't this exist? I really want to build this. And in parallel, there was a moment where the main artist of the studio, he has a secondary studio in Copenhagen. He was flying between Berlin and Copenhagen a lot. And at one point he came in to a meeting, sort of like really tired from the airport, and kind of joked like, oh, if only we could just, put on these goggles and just have this meeting while I was still in Copenhagen. And then it really clicked for me, like, okay, this is something that's worth pursuing. This is something that's worth at least, exploring. And it was an art studio, so it wasn't the right context to really pursue what ultimately is a software product. And so I realized, okay, I have to take this into a different context, which I guess is, Silicon Valley and the tech startup world.
And Berlin
yeah,
has a hot startup scene and a hot art scene. So you're kind of situated in a really good place there.
It's been I feel very fortuitous to have had this spark, in a place where there were people around to pick up on it. Although I do have to say that at the end of the day, from my limited experience of such things, there still is no place like San Francisco when it comes to really building things at the edge of what's possible.
That's its own conversation. I think we could have a riff on that as well. Yeah, Silicon Valley has this very strange and interesting effect on everything. And I want to bring us back sort of to this idea of alternate user interfaces and also not limit our conversation to the present or to past experiments or even to code being written today, but just kind of let us wander a little bit into what we think is possible and how it might work, what the limitations might be, but what the opportunities might be. And I want to add to the mix something that's become really important for me, which is memory or permanence or persistence, I call it. And one of my problems with cyberspace right now, with the web, with the intertubes, with whichever one you want to call it, is that it's all flow and not very much stock. We're drowning in the info torrent. Every year somebody invents some damned new social media thing, like it was Snapchat, then it was TikTok, and who knows what the next year is going to give us. But I every day I have to do my sweep. It's like I'm on a bunch of different media and I have to go figure out what somebody said on each one. And if somebody says something memorable or useful, or in fact something I need to reply to, like must reply to, I have to now remember which damned medium was it in. And it's all lost in this all siloed up kind of my experience of cyberspace, right? And it feels like that and so many other things are big opportunities to change how this works and how we think about it. John, where has your mind gone since Minority Report and sort of that marker, in the sense of, and I love that your experience there was so deep, in the sense of, you can stand and deliver a talk while giving the interface and showing what it does and how it actually works. There are gesture primitives that you created and internalized. And so by doing that practically, I think you hit a bunch of barriers and overcame them, and then hit some walls that you knew you couldn't overcome, because that's where the limits of that were. What else have you sort of started thinking in terms of where these types of augmented or alternate interfaces could go?
I think any discussion like this can either proceed by nominating a bunch of deficits and holes and absences, or just skip that and talk about the stuff that would fill them in, or you can kind of do both. But for me, I think there's a couple of pinnacles that you can kind of see even from our kind of squashed to the ground position where we are right now. One, and maybe this is sort of the catch-all, is just generic agency and efficacy. Like, that should be the metric by which we assess a UI. And even that sentence already, like, I don't know how far back I'm going to push myself here. Like, we have to go back a step to say, we don't talk about UI. God bless us all here, and you especially, Jerry, for creating a little 90-minute space-time window where we can talk about it. But by and large, it's not a fit topic, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, you don't talk about it.
UI is Bruno. We don't talk about Bruno either, but right. Yeah.
But a few of us do. And so if we're going to talk about it, then the first thing we have to ask is, how much agency does it afford you? How much efficacy? Like, what does it let you do that you couldn't do by yourself? And I think it's not even particularly cynical to say that the last 15 years of concerted and well-funded development has all kind of pushed toward a narrower and narrower and smaller efficacy set of tools and set of ways of thinking about what digital stuff even is. Like, what is the substance of the machine, and therefore what is the substance of our minds? Conversely, my view has always been that the machine, the computer systems that we build on it, should be like an exoskeleton for minds,
like
and
Sigourney
for
Weaver,
wills.
like Sigourney Weaver in the
Yeah,
mech
yes, but
in
exactly,
Aliens,
exactly.
except
So
software.
forget
And the
bicycle.
xenomorph is ignorance.
Well, I guess forget bicycle for the mind, because that's a metaphor that never quite worked for me. But an exoskeleton, something that lets you extend your reach in a benevolent, not xenomorph smacking way necessarily, but something that lets you extend your reach, something that lets you transduce your ideas and your human will into a larger pool of ideas, and in some cases into physical reality. So that's the efficacy piece. 2 is collaboration, right? The personal computer that begat all this, and we haven't really gone past it, we just carry it around with us now, is arguably too personal. It is, in fact, entirely solipsistic, both by dint of the way the operating system works. I mean, the stuff like the indictment can start at the UI, but it gets all the way down to the silicon, right? Because the UI is the part of the computational world that you get to see and touch and feel and experience, and it's supported by, and therefore defines and inflects what's at the OS level. And so all of these machines, all of these systems were defined solely to support the activities and the thinking and the work of an individual person at a time. And that's so unhuman. I really want to get back to Yiliu's early days in architecture, because I think that, I don't know, but I have to think that all of the great stuff that's kind of pouring into Softpace and the sequence of prototypes starts with space. I mean, it is Softpace after all. So, physical architecture is inherently collaborative, unless it's an isolation tank or a coffin. Just thinking about that for the first time. But otherwise, like, we build architecture for people to come together and to accomplish certain tasks. We're eating together, we're watching a talk, we're sitting around a table debating, we're throwing cream pies at each other in the war room, to call back to something that happened before the recording started, and so forth, right? Like, the architecture kind of encapsulates and reflects the activity. And we haven't built UIs and operating systems in that mode. So from my point of view, all systems, all operating systems, all UIs, and all application level systems should be inherently collaborative. And that can't happen unless the OS and the basic UI already has that idea. Like this, this sort of video multi-communication thing, it astonishes me that this is a business. Like, this should be just like
A given.
what a computer does.
Bingo.
Like, every computer just does this because of course you want to do, but no, and I'm happy for Eric, and he's got a, I don't know what, $100 billion market cap company, whatever. But that's sort of an indictment. So efficacy, collaboration, and then a third one that I'm going to nominate is exhilaration. It seems to me that those of us who were, who saw the stuff climb out of the primordial slime in the late 70s and early 80s can remember clearly the excitement that surrounded the idea of technology. And, we can say that it was overly utopian, or we could say that what we've got today is a little bit overly dystopian. But something about how, the giant Katamari wheel has rolled along and picked up more and more and more. It's not picking up everything. Like, it's picking up stuff in a single axis, and the exhilaration is gone. I mean, Google or Meta or whoever or Apple can have their yearly conference or a big announcement and try to make something pretty dull, ultimately, something like, in the grand scheme, pretty dull, as exciting as they possibly can with the aid of expensive agencies. But, it's like we're just in one corner of Toledo and there's all of the continent and all of the world still out there with all of its stuff, and we're not allowed to talk about it, right? Like, so the excitement, the exhilaration still exists. It's just not being implemented. And I think that just as I would propose to measure a UI by its degree of efficacy, I would also propose to measure it by its degree of inherent exhilaration. And and the kind of precursors for that, the analogs, are the things that we do as humans that are, you know, sort of cognitive and physical at the same time. So playing an instrument or scuba diving or dancing, like all of that stuff that's mind and body at the same time. That's what exhilaration feels like. And I think all of us on this call know that a digital system can do that also. We've seen it, right?
Yeah.
We've felt it, we've experienced it. We just don't build like that anymore.
Exactly. Yiliu, before going to you, I just want to make explicit something that is a force or an energy around this topic that's almost like background radiation from the Big Bang for us. And it sort of starts with Engelbart's 1968 Mother of All Demos, in which his whole thing is about collective intelligence. The whole thing is about collaboration. Everything about it isn't just about overlapping windows and mice. They invent the mouse, for God's sake. But it's all that. And then a bunch of people interpret that vision and turn it into single player, single user, personal productivity systems. Jobs and Gates, both geniuses in different ways, had to be blackmailed, bribed, and threatened into multi-user anything. They were like, no, this is a bicycle for one mind, or this is like a personal productivity tool. And yet, and there's a bunch of people grousing, I think very appropriately, that so much was offered to us by Engelbart's vision that still has not been really tapped. We have not gotten in there. And then at some point, we wasted a whole bunch of pixels, and we actually turned this into the WIMP interface, the Windows mouse pointer, etc. Forgetting exactly what WIMP stood for. But that is now the tractor beam that draws everything back into it. So the desktop metaphor is like this black hole with an event horizon that eats startups. And I was a big fan of Prezi. I used Prezi as my go-to storytelling tool for a long time. And Prezi redid itself twice, once to look more like PowerPoint, but I could still do with the original magic with the zebra menus. And then twice more recently, they just lobotomized themselves. They just killed off the endless whiteboard that I could tell stories in. And I now have no tool to go tell endless stories in. I'm searching, trying to figure out, why did they do that? Well, they did that because there's this uphill climb to get anybody to use anything that doesn't look like Office, right? And so this is a tractor beam that pulls all startups toward it, and it's the brave and unusual startup that can ignore that and go someplace else. And I think XR, VR, AR is an attempt to leap to some new place. And maybe if we stand in some new place, and then I see augmented reality things with desktop metaphor sprinkled in, and my heart aches, my heart bleeds. So Yiliu, how do you cope with being a startup on that event horizon in this environment? Do you detect the force I just described, and then how do you either fight it or ignore it and just leap to some new place?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. You're not imagining it. I think my biggest shield against it might just be my ignorance. I literally don't know how to write JavaScript. I only know Unity, C#. So I'm incapable of taking that direct line into the event horizon, where I just, make a really fast and dirty and functional 2D UI. I have to invent some, convoluted 3D way of doing it. But just there's so many really, really, really juicy points here. And so I've been thinking a lot recently, mostly because I have to put this down in writing for a couple of different things I'm working on. But I've been thinking a lot recently about what the concrete benefits are of having an immersive 3D interface. I get this question a lot, especially when I share my work on Twitter, and what you see inevitably of when I'm building is just a 2D representation of it, through the lens view, something in a video. And I get this question a lot from the internet and from other people not on the internet. Like, what is this really adding beyond maybe the novelty of the third dimension? And I think of it, the answer to this in terms of three separate pillars. So the first has a lot to do with, Jerry, what you mentioned early on, memory and persistence. And there is now this, finally, it has been established that a spatial canvas can be a legitimate paradigm for building a serious software tool, right? It took a really long time for that to happen. And I know we, in our other call, we had sort of mixed feelings about the Figma acquisition, but I do think that Figma, at least for people in my position who are trying to build something that is legible to capital and gatekeepers, that is also trying to push the envelope. Something like the Figma acquisition just takes it shaves like 15 to 30 minutes off of every conversation. People ask, like, can UI innovation actually be worth all the headache? Won't someone else just steal it from you? Won't Adobe just steal it from you? Actually, no, it can. Like, you can make this work within the our existing flawed system of allocating capital and funding innovation and all that. And so just to say that we finally recognize now that something that every human being knows all the time, except when they're using their computer, which is spatiality matters. It really, the way that our brains and bodies have evolved over millions of years, literally, if you could not remember where like 100 different things were in your environment at different scales, and that some of the things are moving, and some things are seasonally, if you couldn't sort of juggle all that in your head, you would starve to death, or you would like fail to find your way back to the village, right? So we have a much greater capacity for remembering and reasoning about things in space than basically any software interface right now is really, taking advantage of. Any sort of like mainstream popular software interface. And so for me, what something like Figma or Canva or all these other the upcoming Apple Freeform app, what that's doing is legitimizing this idea that space is an important part of UIs. And I can talk about this a little bit more later on as well. And my contention is that Canva does not go far enough, right? If you want to think what the ultimate interface for harnessing all of our superpowers of spatial perception, of spatial memory, cognition, would be, short of a brain-computer interface, like a shunt, it would have to be an embodied three-dimensional interface. So that's one. The second thing is, and this I think connects, John, to your point about efficacy or agency within a UI. And I know this connects to things you're working on right now, because I've seen some examples of this. The second trend that I'm seeing is people building software taking seriously the idea that certain kinds of knowledge, and possibly all knowledge, has this underlying associative network structure to it. And this is something that, harkening back to the earliest days of the internet, people knew, like Ted Nelson knew that forever ago, right? And we also know this because the internet, every time you click on a link, that's what's going on. But the power of the UI is such that the way that these links are represented to us in the user interfaces of a web browser completely obscures this underlying reality. And therefore people, if even today, I mean, not even like today, I tell people, oh, I'm building a spatial knowledge graph. And then they'll say, what's that? And I say, oh, well, like all knowledge is, all information is sort of like in the form of pieces with different relationships. And they're like, wait, what? No. And they think it's like, no, all knowledge is an Excel table, or all knowledge is like a giant Word document, right? Because those are things or maybe all knowledge is like a 10-point pitch.
Familiarity is part
because
of it, right?
that's
what they know,
right? That's what they know. And so my contention there with a 3D interface is that we have forgotten that all knowledge, or we kind of like have this double think, or we do know that all knowledge is in the form of a graph. And we don't know it at the same time because we don't have the interfaces that can actually show it to us in that way. And I say this, we almost don't have any. So there are things like, so Rome has really popularized the idea that everyone can work very directly with a knowledge graph. And then there are, plugins and sort of like clones of Rome that are then creating this graph view in your computer that shows this like pretty hard to use GUI of a knowledge graph. And I've seen versions of this for more specialized use cases. Like I think Palantir's product has some sort of like GUI like that. But my contention there is still that, a computer's, even a huge monitor display is just too small and flat to really let you work with a knowledge graph. And it may not even be the case that representing a full knowledge graph so literally is the best way to go. But at least with my prototypes, what I've been discovering is that when you can actually step into such a structure and look around and sort of like focus on one piece that you're working on, and then just look up and see, oh, what's around, what's over there, what's a bit further away. And then to go see the other piece, you don't destroy your view of the current thing you're looking at, you just move over. And therefore your brain is building up this spatial relationship between the first thing and the second thing. Already goes a long way to making these structures, giving us greater agency in working with these structures, as John would say. And then the third piece is just, like collaboration, social co-presence. Meta has gone on a lot about this. And I do believe that actually that is a major superpower of head-mounted 3D displays, that you can represent other people remotely in a way that is just much more just like emotionally impactful than on video.
In scratching sort of Palantir, you raised another type of UI that people are quite familiar with and is completely quirky, which is murder boards. Basically, if you watched Homeland or other sorts of things, when there's a crime and somebody starts pinning photos to the wall, and then they're scribbling, and then they take news clippings and they put them on, and then they take yarn and pins and make connections between, like, people know what a murder board is. I just heard the term recently, but it's like, it's a map, sometimes with more dimensions than just a bulletin board, but it's a map of what's happening. And then I'm reading right now a book about songlines that isn't Bruce Chatwin's book that kind of put songlines on the map, but it's called Songlines: The Power and Promise by Margot Neal Garuguara and Lynn Kelly. And it's a beautiful book. And I bring this up because songlines are basically memorized oral culture only stories about the landscape. And Aboriginal Australian culture is embedded in language and landscape. And the songlines include a narrative of navigation of how to get from here to there. The story of how the landscape was born. That over there is a series of lizards, like the 7 lizards who did this, who did that. A series of easements and property rights that are baked into the songlines, and who gets to do what where. A series of totems or taboos for the different tribes. Each tribe has a taboo animal of some sort that they don't hunt, they don't eat, but it's different from the next one. All these things are woven into songlines that are memorized and passed down for, it could be 40,000 years. It could be 60,000 years. We're not really quite sure when this all started, but it's intricate and it's all about space. And and this happened for all indigenous tribes around the world, sorry, forget all, for many, so many indigenous ways of knowing were tied to the land that when they were torn from the land, their systems were shredded and really endangered. And part of what's happening now, as we're starting to wake up and go, ooh, indigenous ways of knowing important, we should do something. It's like, guess what? We've pushed everybody off onto the worst bits of land in each of the countries that we colonized. And so maybe I'm thinking here, this thought hadn't come to me until this moment. Maybe we're trying to decolonize idea space. And we're trying to create a space in which it's okay to hang things and have discussions in some sets of new spaces, whatever they are. And I'm really interested in what spaces we're talking about, because it doesn't all have to mirror actual geography and physical space. It doesn't have to do that at all, right? There can be all sorts of abstract spaces. What do those spaces look like? And how do we deal with this in a way that gets us beyond the tractor beams of not just the desktop UI, but also sort of colonialism in some weird way? How do we free ourselves to experiment in those spaces?
Man, there's a lot there. Yes. I think that you mentioned abstraction, and I've as time goes on, I've become more and more convinced that modern Western society, especially around technology, gets the balance and the apportionment of abstraction and literalism exactly wrong every time. There's a lot to be said about video games. I think in our prep call, I mentioned that in my view, the best new UI work consistently for the last 30 years has happened there. It's just that it doesn't get credited because academics don't like to associate with video games and that sort of fluffery. But in fact, it's really, really important. But the great transmedia granddaddy, Henry Jenkins, I think it was he who said, nothing has held back the advancement of video games more than the drive to photorealism. And like if you just look, I love, Yiliu, that you were kind of going to capital allocation, and Marxism is just over the horizon there, but like, where has the money gone? Well, a huge amount of money has gone into figuring out subsurface scattering so that the skin looks better and blah, 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 blah. But the content and the experience and the exhilaration does not lie there. And 98% of all video games are representational in a kind of art history sense, and a few of them are not. And the ones that aren't, I think, have a lot to teach us. All the way back to Tempest, my favorite of the early, arcade video games, which is pure, like it's a narrative of pure geometry and peril and stuff, but it's pure geometry. Like, well, what is that? What am I? I don't know, but and on and on like that. I think that maybe we should rummage around in space for a bit. And to start at the very beginning, the single best theory of the emergence of consciousness that I know of is by a great, still, I think, living neurophysiologist called Rodolfo Llinás, who is retired, I think, but was at NYU. And he has a fantastic and super accessible book called Eye of the Vortex. That's I, like the first person pronoun, in which he describes consciousness as a mechanism that arose out of the need to move, period, right? Like if you're sessile, if you're a plant stuck in the ground, you don't need to plan because you kind of can't. And so you don't need consciousness. But as soon as you're one or a few cells going, through an ocean, you need to know what to swim toward or away from, or what to try to eat, or sidle up to, or whatever. And to do that, you need an internalized model of the external world. And in his view, that begets consciousness. If that's true, that means our brains and, a lot about what we are and how we think and how we understand the world is about space. It's about the movement of bodies through space, causality that happens in space and time. So for every programming language in the world to ignore that, to ignore both space and time as basic constructs, for UI to effectively water down space until it's like the shabbiest possible interpretation of someone's awful desktop, and thank goodness you can't even see mine here. Like, for all of those things to be true, it's like, missing the gigantic pear that is so low hanging and so enormous that it's actually touching the ground and it's right there, and almost no one's, even nibbling at it, right? So I think space is the place. And
space is the place. There we go. We have a tagline for the call.
Right, like, so we can, we can literally imagine reifying the memory palace, which was kind of a metaphor or an analogy, but we can make the memory palace real. There's the highly eccentric German art historian Aby Warburg, whose final work in about 28 or 1929 was a thing called the Bilder Atlas, the picture atlas, which was incredibly personal, and it's a gorgeous work. It was about 60 panels, about 6 feet high, 4 feet wide, on which he had tacked murder board style, basically reproductions of works of art and newspaper clippings and everything, panel by panel. It was his representation of the world. So his view alone, but he thought it might have utility and currency for other people. And the Warburg Foundation in London occasionally mounts exhibitions of this stuff. But in order to see it, you have to rent a warehouse and stage these things around. So he's literally situating ideas in space, juxtaposing them, the relative positions of each board and each item on each board is not incidental, is in fact the substance and the meaning. The meaning comes from the connections and the associations.
I love that.
There's
just so many cool things here.
Yeah. The meaning is between the pieces. That absolutely resonates with me. One thing I would layer on there is, and that's a good jumping off point, the Aby Warburg, essentially sort of analog sort of Softpace is unfortunately how I'm going to think about it. And this reminds me a lot of the walls and desks and working spaces at the artist studio where I was working before this. One thing I would layer on that is that software does have all these advantages that add to these analog working methods, right? These analog working methods are actually super cumbersome, and it's a testament to their value to us that we go through all the trouble of like clearing out this amount of like wall space or board space or whatever, and then printing out, or however you have to manifest in physical media these ideas, and then pinning them up, and then if something changes later on, spending hours or days like rearranging things, and a lot of these operations, I mean, all these operations are trivial, and can't be too trivial. They can sort of like lose their meaning if they're too automatic in the software environment. But you can save a lot of time, I think, analogously to how the digital spreadsheets grew out of the paper spreadsheet. But then because of the speed with which you could run calculations and change things around, enabled a whole new way of using spreadsheets, which was this sort of like speculative fiction corporate finance thing, where you could like do models and tell stories about what could be if X, Y, and Z. I think another maybe more fundamental or deeper question that the murder board to software murder board that transition raises is, what are the underlying semantic primitives? If we're going to talk about the meaning is in the space, okay, great. I mean, Aby Warburg was an artist. I think artists have a lot to teach us about things that they're just beyond our current capacity to articulate, right? That's like almost like kind of the artist's job to point like, there's something there in that general direction. I don't know what to call it. We don't have to think about it yet, but like, go look there. And I think this is maybe a similar area where we don't. I mean, I have some ideas, that are working hypotheses that I have to incorporate into the software I'm building, but I don't think we really know yet what the primitives are of spatial semantics, are of like associative knowledge graphs. And because we don't know, and a lot of these applications, what happens is you just have this sort of undifferentiated reference, right? It's like, oh, this link points to that thing. And then you build it all up and it's like, oh, just like a giant spider web of things that point to each other. Within really specific domains, of course, you can have like a controlled vocabulary of, these are the 3 ways that things can relate to each other. If it's literally a detective's office with a murder board, it might be like, these people know those people spoke to those people, etc. But in a more general sense, I don't think the thing is, there may not be, right? There may not actually be a general purpose knowledge graph, relational semantics or whatever, but we know so little about how these things even work. And it's only through the process of trying to build software that reflects that Aby Warburg style murder board. This term, I'm not sure about it, but okay. Because to build a software, you have to define it explicitly, like what is that connection, and therefore now we have to think about it.
Yeah.
Well, surely the best way to figure that out is to try as many experiments as possible, which is a little bit anathema to the current kind of startup feel, right? And kind of academia has been hollowed out by the pull of the Bay Area and by the nonsense of people like Peter Thiel saying, no, the less you know, like the sooner you get started as a strapping young capitalist, the better for everyone, right? But
at 7, start at 7. No, 5.
In utero, that's when real creativity begins. There's something structural here as well. I think that that could use a little work. That's not how all of this started. Weirdly, right? I mean, it sort of. Well, no, it didn't. Right? You've got Engelbart. He's like a one human Cambrian explosion. Blah, right? And everyone's like, "Oh, thank you very much. We'll take the mouse." And he's like, "No, but oh no, just sit in the corner, Doug. You've done well. Thank you very much." Right? So there's that, and there's Xerox PARC, Bell Labs, but it's just a few people in each case. So
I gave a speech to the senior leadership of Xerox when Paul Allaire was CEO, invited in by their CIO when I was writing for Esther. And I basically said to them, hey, you guys, you who have invented half of the Tinker toys that are on the table right now, there is an opportunity for you to dive deep and sort of fix how we communicate through ideas, through documents and all that. And then shortly after that, not because of me at all, they renamed themselves the Document Company and went right back to business as usual. But the first sign I had of trouble in that meeting was the guy who introduced me put up a foam core board that was like 6 feet wide and a foot big, a foot tall, and had on it their strategic planning process, which was a timeline lasting 2 years. And it showed like a little flow diagram of it, and there was a little arrow in a piece of it that said, "We are here." And I was like, OMG, the web has just broken into the world. All bets are off. If you sit here and hang on to your 2-year strategic planning cycle, you are dead, people. And I felt like my talk went into an anechoic chamber. I could hear my ideas just sort of be absorbed into the sound deadening, the soundproofing material in the walls and not make it into anybody's heads. It was crazy. And so there's this real danger that we wind up losing so much of what's just on the table right in front of us, as we started saying. And Yiliu, to go back to what you were saying a bit, there are a lot of philosophers and deep thinkers who've done some really good work on this. A simple one is Scott McCloud's book, Understanding Comics, has the Big Pyramid, which, and I'll do a really quick screen share because I pulled it up, looks like this, and basically says, hey, weirdly, sometimes the more abstract the comics character, like in Tintin, which is one of my favorite cartoons in the world, the scenes are lifelike, but Tintin's face is always this oval with just a couple dots for eyes. And you're like, wait, what? A, how does that work as art? How does it work that I'm always seeing Tintin, but not worried about his expressions? And B, part of what McCloud is saying is that the more abstract the character, the easier it is for us to slip inside them and to sort of adopt what their point of view or see what they're thinking or whatever. And there's this problem with the boundary with realism, John, that you put in the conversation earlier. So there's partly that, but then also it seems like we're not going to end up with one winner for what the right philosopher is and what the right abstraction is and what the right set of protocols and primitives are. But I think we're going to end up having a series of protocols and APIs or agreements or something that allow us to honor different perspectives and ways of seeing, but then have this conversation in the middle. And I'm really interested in what that middle is, because if we're going to have group tools for thinking, multiplayer tools for thought, then we need to have an arena where we're thinking together and playing together. And in a fit of pique a little while ago, I bought the domain thebigfungus.org to give it some kind of playful name, because I feel like a lone ant feeding the fungus that feeds the hive when I add things to the brain that I'm constantly curating. And I'm looking around going, this is really fun. Where is everybody? And a piece of what the challenge here is describing where the space is. Like where are we putting this stuff? If you ask me where Wikipedia is, I can tell you where the servers run, how they're funded, what software they're running, where the data is, which is all open source, et cetera, et cetera. Wikipedia, because it's an encyclopedia and it's using a conventional model and it's insanely popular, is really easy to explain. You bump up a level of abstraction from there and it's suddenly we're lost, we're unmoored, we're unanchored. And one of the things we need in this space is, I'm going to borrow here from yoga, the sense of a drishti. And when you're doing a one-legged asana and you're trying to balance and you're like, you pick a point someplace, and that's your drishti, that's your anchor point for the pose. And it helps you completely settle down and hold a difficult pose. We don't really have drishtis in these new cyber spaces or metaverses or whatever, or we're not paying enough attention to that somehow. I don't know, but we need to ponder some of these things and then drop them down into the arcane world of concrete code, right?
I really like that. I will meditate on that analogy. So I'm not sure if this is too concrete an interpretation of what you were just describing, Jerry, but your question does bring to my mind a lot of interesting projects, some of which I believe will be joining us at BetaWorks, that are trying to, that already are proposing an alternate answer to where is that digital thing I'm looking at, beyond the sort of like centralized, corporation-owned, not your data model that, for better or for worse, is the only model up until this point that has at scale provided the sense of, oh, I know where that is. I know what, I also know like that could disappear if the company goes bankrupt or whatever, but at least I know for now where it is. And you know, I don't know if it's obvious, but a lot of these models do rely on Web3 or a decentralized technical infrastructure and value, like economic incentive structure, to keep these things alive and around in some immutable address and location. Things
like IPFS, the interplanetary file system, DAOs, NFTs, all that kind of stuff. Keep going.
I think specifically IPFS is at least being explored very actively as a possible model for a way for me to put something on, you know, into this virtual sphere, into this higher plane, where everyone else can also access it, can then incorporate some version of it, or not even a version of it, it can incorporate a view of it in their own tool that of their choosing, that either they built or, you know, that they decided they want to use. And as a builder of maybe something more like the coming together, the space where this information is then made accessible to a group of people, I'm very, very excited about all this activity in this direction, because otherwise my only alternative is, you know, using Firebase or using AWS or using one of these more standard models, and then also, you know, at least offering a local first storage model so the user can always like have access to have access to a copy of their data if the server shuts down or they close their account or whatever.
Right, love that.
It feels like through all of this there's a job description that isn't currently advertised or filled, for that matter. Like there's some superb meta work to be done here. I mean that with a lowercase m in the original sense, not copyrighted sense of that.
A meta classic. I think we need to have a backronym or something like that now. I hate that.
The appropriation of important words. Anyway, which is, and who knows where this takes place. And again, that probably gets to the sort of structural questions about, is it the job of governments? Is it the job of academia? Is it the job of consortia? Is it the job of citizen scientists? Who knows? But the meta work that I have in mind is to say, like, okay, the best new experiments right now are Softpace and this thing over here, and this really interesting project out of Slovenia, and right, like, and so what is a conceivable lingua franca connecting all of those? Like, what's the interoperability layer both technically and cognitively, that would make it so that, Jerry inside the brain can meaningfully have a conversation with Yiliu inside a soft space construct, right? So that the stuff can flow back and forth, but so that you can also sort of see it in your own preferred relative context, but with, with that sort of, well, this is in this block, but I can see clearly down Broadway in the next block is some brain-like stuff, right? And I can see how it connects. And, there's a philosophical element to that. There's a kind of standards protocol level element to that. And there's a lot of architectural and design stuff too.
Yeah, I'm totally on board with the vision you just painted and struggling with it, because for me, in my imagination, it means that when I reach a particular edge or boundary in the space that I'm exploring, and it's clear that on the other side of that boundary, a different kind of tool is necessary, how do I make an elegant transition into that other tool? And then some of these things are power tools. How do I get good at that tool, or how do I get good enough at that tool where it actually works, right? It's the difference between McDraw and Illustrator or Photoshop. I just never learned Illustrator or Photoshop because I took one look at them and said, this is arcane and like, it's great if you're a graphic artist and it's a money mint, it's a money-making machine for Adobe, but I'm not going to learn it. But I used to draw all my own things in McDraw. And at this point, I'm looking hard. I'm using Excalidraw, which is like this little piece of open source code that works with Obsidian that I can use with Markdown files in really intriguing ways to try to emulate what I used to be able to do in 1990 by myself, right? And so we're kind of lost in the middle there. And then I love that there's a framework called Jobs to be Done, which is really interesting. It's like you hire a milkshake to keep you satisfied for the morning because you're in your pickup going from job site to job site, right? Your things and jobs to be done is often leads to unusual insights because, you hire a politician to get something done you need in your life. And it gives you a very different perspective. And I think you're right. There's a job here to figure out, and unfortunately, it's not a job that Silicon Valley is going to reward very well because it's not a job for locking down IP and milking it for all it's worth. It's a job for building some set of commons conversations and commons protocols and agreements and norms and practices. Then it's a job for going out and talking to the bonfires on the horizon that represent the different communities working on interesting but different and siloed parts of this problem, and encouraging to come play in the general purpose arena because it's going to be better for all of us if we do. And that's hard.
I think there's back to the beginning of that paragraph, your paragraph just now, Jerry. I think part of the answer is pseudopods, baby.
Pseudopods, I like that. Or slime molds.
Yes, well, they should look just like that. Like if you get to the edge of your domain or domain, you should be able to like grab like just a chunk of the soft space stuff next door, pull it into your domain. I actually think that there is a kind of software meta protocol, an interop protocol, by which systems could advertise to each other their capabilities and their sort of basics.
Sounds fantastic.
Right. And so like pull a little soft space pseudopod in volitionally, right? It's not coming at you, but you pull it in and you can play with it. Like, I don't have to learn the whole thing, but like, wow, I see. So I can make this spiky thing. Actually, can I show you something? Actually,
please do. And while you're looking for the thing to screen share, we haven't talked really about machine learning at all yet here, and clearly it can play a huge role. And one of the questions I'm interested in, which I'm going to ask in a future podcast episode here, is, hey, what are the many different ways in which machine learning can help tools for thinking, in particular collective or group, multiplayer tools for thinking? But one of the interesting things that I don't think is on anybody's radar is what you just said, John, which is there could be a companion app that says, oh, hey, Jerry, you're walking into a setting, a situation, a question, a part of your inquiry where you might want to run a simulation, or you might want to do systems analysis using Kumu or a Kumu-like tool, and it would know that you're passing a boundary into a new domain, and it would then know to coach you or help you or find an expert in that domain and make those boundaries actually very fruitful. because otherwise most of us aren't trained in the variety of domains that exist, and we don't know that we've hit a boundary where there's something that could help us solve this problem better. We just don't even know to ask the question.
Yep.
Right. So a system that can have some of that awareness and coach us through could really give us a step function up. And one of my theories of progress, and this is really played out a lot in software, is that it's a step function. Yeah. It's a step function. Every now and then somebody invents a breakthrough changes everything, and then suddenly we're at the end of its S curve, and everybody's like, gosh, this feels really old, but I have no idea what's next. And then boom, somebody invents something new, and now nobody can imagine the world before the iPhone, which launched in 2007, right? It's like really hard for us to imagine a pre-smartphone world, and yet somehow people used to meet. We used to like navigate in cars. We like do all these things pre-smartphone. But so I think we're sitting right in front, and we're talking about here the next step function of what this is, and it's exciting to be having this conversation.
It is, for sure. I can share my screen if
please go for it. And I'm sorry, that was a much longer digression than I thought I was going to.
No, that was right.
Please share screen.
Great. We're eager for the step function, and maybe it can be an even bigger step than in recent times. So what you'll see in a second is purely a prototype, kind of an illustration of some of the things that I just said. But the idea was that if you have the idea of kind of code permeability, so that running systems can kind of jump through the air and land on larger display surfaces, again, always with an eye to collaboration, then you can enable a new kind of collaboration where people with individual systems on their individual devices can physically, and therefore literally, come together in a shared display and interaction space. And if at the same time the systems that they're running have this capability of advertising their own structures and their own capabilities, then maybe some kind of automated minimal interop is possible, even when systems haven't been designed to work together. So let us see then what we can see. Better turn the audio down. Right, so this is a thing called Frog, and you see that as each of these three researchers approaches the giant display, the program that's running on, unfortunately in this case, his laptop jumps across and begins executing on the big board, and the tendrils there are meant to indicate that there is, this sort of transaction of meaning between these systems. And your stuff follows you around, so there's a kind of big spatial obligation that's fulfilled here. There was a whole kind of big, urban planning and emergency first responder backstory to this scenario. And again, this is elusive, meant to be elusive and nothing else. But again, highlighting the idea that that ad hoc collaboration is easy for people, and with the right instrumentation of running executable code, it ought to be minimally possible for digital systems as well. It's just that no one's ever built one of these, but I think it's accessible right now.
It's really interesting. The Sugar OS that was on the OLPC did a little tiny bit of not the standing in front of a display and sharing stuff, but you could intersect and interact with people in the OS in ways that were pretty clever. And then Jupyter Notebooks, which is like a lab notebook thing that has a Python runtime basically under the hood. You could imagine that our browser becomes more like Jupyter Lab notebooks, and then that the code simply lets a simulation or something move from screen to screen and be shared more effectively. And those are like really simple, primitive examples of what you just showed. But this is a juicy world I'd like to live in.
Yeah. Yes, please. I mean, Yiliu, do you think that Softpace could become also a meta environment? One of the things that one of the many things I admire about your work and the way you work is the kind of dedication to rapid prototyping, which is really unusual in the startup world, where you're like, oh, go, and you get entrenched and you build hard, and and then it's just sort of shellac layer after shellac layer, but your willingness to kind of build and toss part of it aside and build a new thing feels like that if you, in the best possible way, institutionalized that practice, you could give coders and experimenters a bunch of bricks so that they could do their own little evolutionary explosion and try out all of the experiments that I think are going to be necessary to define the primitives, as you said, and the language and the vocabulary and the grammar and the syntax and the rest of it, which is not something that any one person, no matter how talented, can do, or any one company for that matter, because companies are a really bad structure for that kind of thing.
Yeah. I mean, to be fair, the prototyping phase that we're in the middle of right now, because of the limitations you just pointed to, it's necessarily a bounded period. So it started earlier this year. It came out of my frustration with how much experimentation and how quickly I could experiment. Basically how experimental I could be using a more standard software development, product development playbook for the preceding, number of years. And it probably has to come to a close toward the end of this year, and something that I'm very curious to hear your thoughts probably after this podcast episode, this podcast recording on, would be how to maintain some amount of this sort of like destabilizing, open-minded, open-ended play, while also, serving paying customers and solving real problems and having people who are using your thing, hopefully to solve real-world problems, but therefore are also reliant on a dependable, sort of concept architecture and all that. The question about whether, or who is building an interop layer for all these spatial software experiments, I think ultimately that does have to come from the organizations that have the resources and have the power here, which are the, as of today, the hardware manufacturers. So they would have to be the ones to say, we're going to build the OS layer such that it has all of these capabilities that we're that we're dreaming of in this conversation. One interesting design heuristic that this reminds me of, when I spoke to someone many years ago who was an interaction designer at then Oculus. One thing they told me was a rule of thumb that the organization had for when it came to how hard to try to or how much effort to put into making virtual behaviors visible or synchronized across multiple users was based on our expectations from the real world. So my expectation, if I am sitting with you at a table, I pick up a piece of paper and I move it like this, my expectation is that you would see that transformation, but then from your point of view, right? It would be very strange if I would be able to scrawl a sketch on this piece of paper and you couldn't see it, even if I was holding it right in front of you. And so that places quite a high sort of threshold or quite a high standard on these immersive spatial interfaces to make everything to make everything meaningful, sensible across different software, right? Across different paradigms, even. And so I think
it has to map
somehow.
Yeah,
it has to map somehow. It has to map somehow, or it doesn't map at all. But then you risk like me doing something which I think is important and meaningful, and you can't even your version of the app doesn't even let you see what I'm doing, right?
Which is some points is just gonna happen. It's gonna break because other software doesn't do the magic thing that your software does, and vice versa.
But isn't a first cut at that, again, to be completely literal? That is to say, you're doing your thing, and your floating orb of activity kind of bumps into Jerry's. Like the minimal thing is just to literally see what he sees, maybe backwards, I don't know, but like, and that can be done at the pixel level. It doesn't require at that stage software interop.
Mm-hmm. So you're right, John, that then the lowest common denominator becomes what you would expect a physical version of this thing to how it would behave. I'm already running into design decisions where I have to make a decision, a trade-off between what is. I'll give you a really, really concrete example. Say the three of us were standing in a Softpace prototype, and we had a few images floating around us. And in the current version of the prototype, the images automatically rotate to present their themselves to you head on. And that's very helpful, because then you don't even think about whether I have to move to a certain place to see what the image is. Everything is sort of just displaying itself to you. What do you do when there are 2 people in the space, or 500 people in the space, right? So the default would be that, okay, things have a canonical rotation, which means it's suboptimal for the individual viewers. But then if I pick it up and move it, I think I am moving it or turning it like this, everyone else sees it being turned that way, and therefore we can communicate via its sort of one standard spatial semantic rotation, right? Spatially meaningful rotation. But then you trade off against some of the power of a software environment, which could show you things, it could adapt itself to make it more visible to you.
And the dilemma you're painting is almost funny, because anybody who's used Google Docs to collaborate online with somebody knows that staring at the same document and being able to edit it with other people is really, really powerful, right? And it's sort of more powerful than 5 people standing around a screen trying to collaboratively edit a document and talking to the scribe or whatever else. So in some weird way, when we're reinstantiating physical space with an audience or a group trying to collaborate online, we've like thrown ourselves back into the stupid problem of, hey, who's the screen facing and how does that actually work in the space? Which you've described one fix for that, which is nice, because really I love Google Docs for collaborating on writing stuff. It works really pretty clearly, and there's a bunch of other tools now that know how to do that, right?
I think there are simple, at the first layer, at the first level, there's a set of small integer number of simple heuristics and approaches that can address the problems that you've raised, Yiliu. And I think all that stuff, I actually have another video that I could show that that comes at some of it, but let's not waste time with that. Like, there's, I think, a little tiny bit of additional vocabulary, like basically diacritical marks that let you know whether a particular element is being universally seen. Like this thing is, you're seeing it backwards because you're on the other side, right? And so it doesn't have the diacritical mark. And then a version of it, which you can toggle, where now everyone can see that you're seeing this piece of the environment, the landscape, the topology, the topography, in a way that privileges you. So just there's unbelievable power, as we've all been saying, in the simple idea of co-seeing. If we stand in a physical space, we look in the same direction. I don't have to wonder if you're all seeing the rabid ocelot that's coming toward us, right? Like, we all know that. And that is an incredible cognitive capability. In all of this junk, it's a giant bunch of murk. Like, this junk right here that we're using right now, if there were 6 or 16 of us, let's do Hollywood Squares or Brady Bunch or whatever, it would be the simplest thing in the world for this software to assure that the layout is the same for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
But it doesn't. They haven't figured out that little trick, which means that even simple things like eye lines are always messed up, right? You can play the game where if you got 9 people on, you say, everyone point to Jerry, and everyone's pointing in some other direction. Like, right. So that's ground 0. Then ground 1, I think with a little bit of visual and geometric annotation, you can make clear which elements are being universally seen and identically seen, even if in weird orientations, and which are being seen in some way that privileges a particular viewer or every viewer, or which things are redacted because you're not allowed, I don't want you to see my email, even though I've exploded my 2D screen and you're seeing all the elements shifted around.
Exactly.
So I think it's just, I feel like the word is permission, right? Like you just need to take for yourself, and nobody gonna give it to you. Take the permission to just invent all that stuff. I'm speaking to all of us, not, like I think there's that kind of, like we're under this very low ceiling of implied non-permission, and we've all been crouched down so long that like it hurts, and straightening up is gonna take a little doing. But
we're all on floor 9.5 and being John Malkovich. It's like you have to kind of crouch and walking around. You're seeing through John Malkovich's eyes, which is really disconcerting. But that's a form of co-seeing in some weird and twisted way. We've almost eaten all of our time. We're close to 90 minutes, and I'm wondering what questions are lingering in your head, and if you had a research agenda or a startup agenda, what would you propose? Just some kind of a greenfield question to take us out of the call. It can be either way. Like what questions has this raised for you that would you like to see answered, or if you could set up an agenda for what to build, what to do, what would that look like?
So John, the last thing that you said about taking action, let's say, and not needing permission. I think the question I would leave this call with is, how do you invent truly new things, truly new and good things, not just novelty for novelty's sake, but truly new and good things, in the face of, myself included, people being quite lazy and unwilling and unable to invest the necessary time and effort and energy often to learn those new things? Because I think, John, what you were describing there about, like, why do we feel so hemmed in by these these ghosts that there's no one stopping me from just doing it? I think the thing that's maybe stopping me, for example, is this wisdom that has accumulated, that people will, like, unless you make it super easy for people to adopt, it's not going to work, And so the question would be, how do you actually work from first principles and develop things that push the envelope when humans are often the hardest part of the envelope to push?
Humans hard to push.
So I will dock my comments with that stuff, Yiliu. First off, I don't think you're particularly lazy. In fact, I think you're doing some of the best work in the world. But
he's trying to build for other lazy humans.
Yeah, when I open my sort of like I don't know, banking app, I'm also not excited to spend 30 minutes learning some novel UI for managing money, right? It's like I kind of wanted to just show me a bank account, and hopefully it's like a large number.
If you had to do like a Pokemon Go in order to get interest collected on your account, that would be an unhappy moment.
So just admitting that I am lazy when it comes to other people's innovations. Yeah.
Well, maybe if they sucked less, you'd be more inclined to deal with it. And to that point, one answer, and it's only a tiny bit facetious, is to maybe put a bunch of new ideas inside video games, right? Like that's sort of the last Starfighter idea, right? Like train people to use the digital world in a new way, not to fight battles like in that movie, but to do mutually beneficial things. I think so. My outro here is to wonder what the new human organizational structures, which is a big theme for me these days, are going to be, need to be, but then can be implemented. Like what are the new accessible human organizational structures that will let what you asked about happen, right? Bell Labs and Xerox PARC are gone, and the behemoths that should be making the new ones of those, and we all know them, aren't, right? Like whatever the political, financial, whatever, even kind of philosophical structure no longer exists. So that's out. Governments, I think, have a really important role to play, but it's not at the kind of sitting in the lab working on stuff level. It's more at the kind of, high level structural approach and funding, and DARPA-ish maybe. So what is that thing? Because I want to do my work cheek by jowl with your work, even if you're a startup and I'm an individual, or I work for a hospital, but I have this, like hobby building this stuff, or whatever it is, right? Like, how do we get together? Here's the big word, community, around these ideas. Because unless we can pull out the control rods, keep the density really tight, like get these ideas together and not working in isolation, then I think the best we get are sort of fizzle yield blips, where the extant megastructures like acquire little ideas and extinguish them or absorb them in some useless way into something else.
Amazing how quickly things are extinguished.
Yeah. So
yeah,
let's build that new megastructure. I have, I'm a little bit obsessed with Black Mountain College.
Oh, fabulous.
There's one of those. There are several of those to be built, but there's probably a really good one to be built with these ideas as one of its kind of core tenets.
So I was just learning about the Nordic folk schools. Do you know about them?
Yeah.
They're quite amazing. Like 10% of the population of most of the Nordic countries went through a folk school, which was kind of like a citizenship school. And one of the reasons we think that the Nordics have like some different sense of quality of life and policy and all those kinds of things is this thing, which was invented back around 1870, 1850, somewhere around there, and then grew and then shrank and is still alive a little bit, but really isn't dominant in any way. But it's also in that same realm of Black Mountain College. These are spaces within which people were able to really be generative, and they were also really playful spaces. It's a little bit, this is maybe a bad analogy, but Bell Labs during its golden age, which was full of scientists and geeks inventing things like the transistor, but was playful also in the sense of highly capable people who would just sort of meet and mingle and have lunch and suddenly run off and invent something new. And we don't have that. John, as you just said, basic research has been gutted. Corporations have thrown most of that investment overboard. Colleges and universities are teaching for basically they're becoming trade schools. Everybody's focused on STEM and what will get me a job. And the humanities are being deprecated. We're sort of losing people who care a lot about art and technology, even as I can point to hundreds of art and technology movements struggling to stay alive around the globe. But they're really struggling to stay alive in many ways, right? And then where they succeed, they get co-opted by the industry of art, and suddenly there's too much money involved, and it's like all screwed up, and it's not the thing you actually want to happen either. So what about that? That's another black hole that's absorbing energy and innovation. So somehow in the middle of all this, we need to stake out, curate, or somehow stake of vibration and energy, an attractor that brings people in without co-opting them, without destroying their models or their goals or their incentives, but enhances the collaborations of the groups. And as a result, leads us back toward reinventing the things we've been talking about on this call, if that makes sense.
You're here.
Okay, so let's just build one.
All right. I'm ready.
I'm in.
It might need a physical location as well, at least for time.
Yeah, exactly. It would help to have a drishti or a platform or a grounding point somewhere in our real world, in meat space, good old fashioned meat space, which we have to backronym as well. We have to say, oh, you mean real life, right? Yeah, real life. Funny, we have to Coke classic everything. I think at this point we're just going to call a halt because I could do this all day with you all. This is just phenomenal. I really I really love this call and want to do this again. So I will head toward our exits, and then we can figure out what's next. Thank you all for listening to Tools for Thinking, a new podcast that just might help you with your thinking. If you're part of a startup in this sector, please knock on our door at betaworks.com/camp. Otherwise, keep listening to these podcasts and join me in thanking John and Yiliu for a fabulous conversation. Really appreciate it.